Welcome to Rewatch-and-Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. And today's episode is Bleach Soul Society, the Sneak Entry Arc, episode 28, Orihime Targeted. Episode in a nutshell is a brief reminder of what happens in the episode. So the episode begins with Ichigo running away from various Shinigami, or rather just running to try to find Ganju, before yelling as loud as he can for Ganju to send up fireworks or something, because he's like obviously run very far. And this, of course, attracts the attention of other Shinigami to him, and then he ends up running from a bunch of Shinigami. We then catch up with Ganju, who he was yelling for, who is able to hear him, but is currently in the midst of fighting Yumachika, who has managed to land a few wounds since we last saw them, and he once again comes across one of the random holes that seem to be in the ground within the Saratai. And Ganju keeps dodging him while trying to use his technique, and they go back and forth for a bit until ultimately he is able to use his technique to get the upper hand against Yumachika, luring him into the edge of the hole before Yumachika then gets frustrated and jumps up into the air, which is when Ganju then throws a firework onto his head, which then ends up exploding. And this leaves Ganju free to continue their mission, and next time we see him, he is also running away from a bunch of Shinigami. Now that both of those fights, Ichigo's and Ganju's, have been concluded, we're now getting a little bit more of an update on the other groups, and we do find Kenpachi's still lost. Mayuri, Ru. Anyways, the one that the captain who's big on the science thing has been looking for the Ryoka as well, and Nemu gets a report, who is his lieutenant, gets a report from a Hell Butterfly reporting Ikkaku's defeat by the Ryoka, so he decides to go and visit Ikkaku to get more information. And then the second half of this episode is mostly taken up with Ishida and Inoue, who are fighting Jirobo, who arrives, and Orihime. Inoue, she isn't able to put killing intent into her attack, so while she does have an offensive power, because she doesn't have the capacity to actually want to fight, he ends up being completely useless as a weapon, and she then, of course, is about to be defeated very easily when Ishida, who had been kind of pushed off the roof a bit, finally manages to climb back up and shoots an arrow at Jirobo, which causes him to then have to back off Orihime. Then Jirobo reveals that his Zanpakuto can be released into basically multiple spinning blades. And these spinning blades, he basically spends a little bit of time giving a speech about and bragging about before Ishida basically does a multi-arrow attack and destroys all of them, which of course is very embarrassing for Jirobo. And then Ishida gets to basically stand really cool on the roof, being all like, look how powerful and awesome I am. And Inoue makes a point to point out that the glove that we had seen in the earlier episodes when they were training, so in the last arc, is now one that Ishida has mastered, and it is that bow which he is using to defeat Jirobo. But the episode ends with him standing and looking cool, not Jirobo's defeat. And that is this episode. So now we can rank the episode on our two lists. We have our mostly objective ranking list, followed by the personal ranking list, which is based solely on my opinion. So mostly objective ranking list, we have our single arc supporting character introduction, which is Jirobo Ikanzaka, which is, of course, the one who attacks Inoue and Ishida, worth 1 point. Then we have worth 2 points the resolved battle between Ganju and Yumachika, which has came to an end at the first half of this episode. And then we have our multi-arc supporting character introduction, which is Nemu Kurotsuchi, who is the lieutenant to Mayuri, who is the science one, how I remember the character. And she's worth 3 points. So that brings us to 6. I didn't think that there was anything that fit under our negative categories in this episode, and so final score is a 6 out of 10. Which brings our mostly objective ranking so far to in first, Enter the World of the Shinigami, second, The Man Who Hates Shinigami, third, Assemble the Gotai 13, Formation the Worst Tag, 14 Days Before Rukia's Execution, Penetrate the Center with an Enormous Bombshell. um, then this episode is 7th, Orihime Targeted, and then in 8th, Release the Death Blow. Bringing us now to my personal rankings. So, I have never pretended not to be biased, but when I don't like characters and the episodes focus on characters I don't like, I tend to not like those episodes. I think it's very logical follow through. I do like Ishida. Ichigo I also like, but obviously his fight's concluded and right now he's just running around being chased. He really only had a cameo in the episode. So, Ishida is the only reason that this episode got points because I do like Ishida. I'm not a fan of Ganju, so his fight, while comedic in nature, glad it's over and he's not as much of a focus anymore. And I did think that and I do like Yumachika, so I guess you can also say he got a point too. But he was basically defeated by a firework, which is very embarrassing. So that wasn't the most epic end to the fight, but also one that made sense based on how not epic that fight was. Then we had like the bulk of the episode, at least the second half, was a new character who really you can tell from the start isn't meant to be important. And because they're not meant to be important, not a lot of effort was put into them. It just is basically, oh, you two use projectiles? Well, guess what? I do too. How great is that? And he then, shows off his projectiles. And Ishida's like, well, I also use multiple projectiles and mine are more powerful and destroys those. And that's what that fight basically amounts to. At least Ishida's portion of it. The Orihime targeted part with Inoue. Like I said, I don't like Inoue as a character. And this is part of why. Like I've talked about it before, burden characters, and how there are certain characters in anime that they always seem to add at least one or two, and like any series that has some sort of fighting, where they'll even give them powers that could make them strong, and yet the characters are so mentally weak, is I think the nicest way I can put it, that they can't even use the power that they're given. And Orihime, again in this episode, demonstrates that. She's she dodges a couple times and she's like, I have to fight for Ichigo, I have to fight. And then she calls her attack power and then just like throws it at him. It's defeated immediately, does 0 damage, and even her own power is like, you threw me for no reason. You had no intent behind the attack. I couldn't do anything before it disappears. And then she just sits there and cowers until Ishida saves her. So ultimately, really pointless. Completely pointless. And I did not enjoy that. So basically, having reflected on the fact that this episode very heavily focused on characters I don't like, and the two characters that I do like are the only reason that got points, I think we can imagine that this episode is a 2 out of 10 because Ishida is worth 1 point and Yumachika is worth 1 point, but pretty much everything else in the episode wasn't really a fan of because it's centered around people I'm not a fan of. And that brings our personal ranking so far to in first enter the world of the Shinigami, formation the worst tag, penetrate the center with an enormous bombshell. Uh, I still haven't gained any maturity. Assemble the Gotai 13, 14 days before Rukia's execution, release the death blow, the man who hates Shinigami, and then this episode does come in last so far, Orihime targeted. Bringing us to our series rankings so far, and our first arc, the Agent of the Shinigami arc, ended with a score of 84 on our mostly objective ranking, and so far our second arc, Soul Society, the Sneak Entry arc, has a score of 66 out of 210. On the personal ranking side, we have Agent of the Shinigami arc coming in at 63%, and the Soul Society, the Sneak Entry arc so far has a score of 45 out of 210. So with that, we've now rewatched and ranked Bleach Soul Society, the Sneak Entry arc, episode 28, Orihime Targeted. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.